Hello, I hope you can hear me enough. I had some difficulties in completing the audio recording in the last lecture or rather the reading of the notes that I presented in the last video. And there was an interruption in the middle, and I'm not sure what caused it, and I did provide a supplement which did cover all the material concerned. This is not about that. This is a review, a critique, and an appraisal of Chapter 4 from The Psychic Life of Power by Judith Butler, presented or rather published in 1997 originally. In the series of notes that I've been presenting, you will find introductions to or rather presentations of the introduction, Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3. This is the fifth video in the series. And without any other briefs, let me get to the reading. Notes on and critique of Chapter 4 in The Psychic Life of Power, Althusser's subjection. The author presents here her take on Althusser's theory of subjection, and what I find most appealing is its conception of interpellation, not merely as the identification of oneself in a call, but the staging of a call, or perhaps better understood as a social scene. Yet, there is a punitive dimension here in the example and in the appropriation of guilt required to be identified in the call. I would, however, like to present the author's account of how the call arrives, or rather, the failures noticed in the form of its arrival, or should I say, mode of presentation. Quote, "Clearly we might say that the call arrives severally and in implicit and unspoken ways, that the scene is never quite as dyadic as Althusser claims. But these objections have been rehearsed, and interpellation as a doctrine continues to survive its critique. If we accept that the scene is exemplary and allegorical, then it never needs to happen for its effectivity to be presumed." End of quote. Allegoricity, or should I say layers of interpretation, act as a protective screen and should be recognized as such. The veneer of another kind of reading, if nothing else, reminds the adressee of another symbolic order in operation. And here, beyond or perhaps beneath the question of supersedence or dominance, are possibilities of exchange and learning. An exception to this is marked by the author as accounted for by Walter Benjamin. When an allegory is literalized, we are told, it will exceed the narrativizability of events. Or rather, the process literalized by the allegory is precisely what resists narration. I think this is a beautiful line, for it offers an account of when the possibility of what permits for an allegory, the multiplicity of reading, or vantage points, is terminated. We no longer address the other in our symbolic order, which then remains foreclosed. A gesture, perhaps not unlike a dismissal, or the passing of a conviction, or perhaps the adjournment of a case. Yet why does the author suggest that this is a call which is made by an officer of the law, left in an ambiguous and capitalized sense? Which law may be invoked here beyond that of mere recognition? Which would actually hold in a hailing that may be instantiated on a street, for example, as Althusser's example presents? Further, why is the call singular and speaking? Interpellation is an identification. Yet if we have gathered anything from the prior three chapters, is the efforts made in the text by the author to secure for the subject the possibility of a certain kind of self-determinacy in interpolation. Even for instance, for the subject to be producing interpolations that require a certain relation to power. Agency, if you notice, is really what the author is wrestling with. An agency that seeks to apprehend the sociality of its own identification, so as to perhaps posit the principle via which it would seek to be identified, not unlike the insistence for the recognition of rights for religious and sexual minorities, which much of Foucault's work has been mobilized towards. The other assertion which would appeal to a broad spectrum of interpolations is the issue of guilt. The I is formed upon the assumption of guilt before the law, in submission to its call for uniformity, and the possibility of an advantage. Why would such a subject turn towards the law? Quote, unless it knew by some experience that there was something to be gained by such a turn. End of quote. An ambiguous terrain indeed, yet there seems to be a kind of interpretative pleasure, perhaps a hermeneutics which the author seeks to highlight. Quote, how and why does the subject turn? Anticipating the conferral of identity through self-ascription of guilt. An idea of the conscience is represented which is required to critically interpret the law, even as it figures the subject's uncritical relation to the law as a condition of subjection. End of quote. The author seems to posit a certain kind of prefiguration that may be required in the subject, an assumption of something akin to what piety might have been in a more religious register, that may be needed in the subject in their turn before the law, prior to presenting any critical questions. Indeed, we may notice here that the law, if it may be spoken of as a position, would then have the opportunity to learn as to why or perhaps what prompted this turn. And in many ways, this is how institutions in the public sphere garner an understanding of the demands of their office. Interpolation, however, with its Althusserian roots, remains a hailing. Who is speaking? Why should I turn around? Why should I accept the terms by which I am hailed? Are here existential considerations in which a selfhood is constructed. Moments of vulnerability, for sure. For if you notice, this hailing, like the symbolic order which perhaps seeks to address it, can only arise from the other. In this measure, it marks a vulnerability that an opening hails me by. I would, however, point out that while such a presentation of interpolation is indeed appealing in terms of how a subject may recognize themselves in their relation to a call for conformity as seen in the law, the origins of the concept are not legalistic. Sartre and Althusser sought to depict via it a model for the way an individual constitutes themselves in relation to a social milieu, amidst bonds, perhaps legal, and commitments that were perhaps not. Indeed, in its most readily recognized form, such as in ideology and ideological state apparatuses, it has been used to present a critique of the state. I would ask a reader to bear this in mind when they read the lines, quote, exemplified in the turn towards the law, in anticipation of a culling an identity in identifying with the one who has broken the law. End of quote. If as children our first introduction to the symbolic order was through what Lacan refers to as the name of the Father, or that authority by which we designate not merely right or wrong, but what these words mean in the first place, in our use of language in society, we are compelled at distinct moments to reinvent how we use them. Laws, however, are admittedly not always legal, inasmuch as the force of custom can carry a weight that is severe. And this is perhaps a reading that may supplement our notion of what may have prompted a turn, by what recognition or cause, and of course in violation of which law, not to mention in complicity with whom. There does appear, however, to be another origin which the author would like to trace for this concept, in Nietzsche and in On the Genealogy of Morals, where the assumption, or rather the price of guilt, is assumed to secure a purchase on identity. This turning can even be towards a call of God, arising from God, in an act of nomination which one turns to in assuming the conferral of an identity. A highly religious assumption, to be sure. Indeed, this call raising the need to constitute a law is left unclear in the aspect of whether this need is an imperative or an injunction from God, or a demand presented, as it were, by a subject. In presenting this religiously charged scene, as it were, the author notices that such reification, if I may, would impede the ability of the subject to critically intervene in the law, a procedure which is necessary for the law to proceed. Also, the author does press that despite its formal reservations, ideology and its corresponding interpolations cannot be thought but through the metaphorics of religious authority. And to be fair, there is textual support for this in Althusser himself, who takes up the example of the Christian religious ideology in the text which the author brings up, Ideology and Ideological State of Paradoxes. Indeed, the author does identify the power of giving a name with its divinatory function of nomination, an act embedded in religious custom, not unlike baptism, for instance, yet with a crucial difference. Interpolation is not an act which is bestowed upon me as a child. This cannot be accomplished, or rather, quote, this cannot be accomplished without a certain readiness or anticipatory desire on the part of the subject, to the extent that the naming is an address, there is an adressee prior to the address. But given that the address is a name which creates what it names, there appears to be no Peter without the name Peter. End of quote. Were one to assess the scenario presented, it would be hard not to see that the subject would perhaps have to be predisposed towards the interpolation in question, or, as presented by the author, a readiness to be compelled by the authoritative interpolation, a readiness which suggests that one is already in relation to the voice before the response already implicated in the terms of the animating misrecognition by an authority to which one subsequently yields. End of quote. Here, it would be necessary to guard against the weakening of our senses amid such inclinations, for this readiness to be compelled by an authoritative interpolation can very well be an example of hegemony, or perhaps a variation of the cult of the charismatic leader. Judgment is called into question, for were one to presume a relation to the voice before the response, we may miss what the response itself constituted. The installation of a conscience in the subject is said to be one of the functions of ideology as conceived by Althusser. The author herself, earlier in the text, mentions an ego ideal whose correspondence with the superego is productive of the anchors which produce a sense of self, and perhaps later manifestations in a drive, for instance. And while the sense of reflexivity which these formations within the psyche entail for the conception of one's selfhood are worth appraising, they may be beyond the scope of the review I have in mind. The author does seem to present an insistence on the cultivation of the ability to speak properly to be a precondition of conscience, as it were. And it must be said that any sophisticated interpolative mechanism would require a faculty of expression, of using words well verbally. However, there may perhaps be a case made of such a faculty itself being maybe even a necessary but insufficient cause of conscience. And indeed, I think one of the author's influences, Derrida, would seek to present a critique of the reduction of interpolation to a rhetorical effect of speech in his privileging of the written word. Remember, he would seek to present a critique of the reduction of interpolation to a rhetorical effect of speech. But admittedly, Derrida himself, I don't think, was particularly fond of the concept of interpolation. I think he was in many ways aligned with the author in as much as they both shared a willingness to study the failures or the incompleted performances of interpolation as perhaps representative of what was not interpolatable in a moment, or rather markers of context and things of that kind, which you may go forth and explore. Interpolation, however, is yet treated here as a linguistic effect, and most formalized divisions of labor today do depend on the transmissibility of instruction to function properly. The acquisition of linguistic skills then marks something of a necessary training which workers would be required to acquire and managers to issue. It also is, however, speaking well, that is, a way in which respect is proffered and or withheld. It may be observed that a consistency of effort may be traced in the work of the author in question, which perhaps may be stated as an attempt to secure for the subject the ability to submit on being called to a symbolic order. And this is what has been construed as interpolation. However, it begins by presenting the scene in a manner in which precisely such a submission, or better yet, to use terms closer to those of the authors, such as an identification, has not already taken place. Indeed, interpolation is not the same as our learning of the fact that there are symbolic orders, or many for that matter. Indeed, it is the act of an acknowledgement of our position in one, and this is not the same as an option which I may choose to identify with. Why is this so? Because any symbolic order would present an opening to the other, and interpolation, or the call on the street by the officer of the law, to use the example presented by Althusser, among many other possibilities, is perhaps a way to express this opening. The recognition of oneself within an order of belonging, if I may, is never merely a choice. It is also a charge which is borne by the subject, the author reminds us. In the admission of our guilt before a religious orthodoxy, for example, it is not simply a question of obsequience before an order, but a task of having to prove one's innocence, even if that is the charge, to uphold the innocence of the accused before law, unless proven otherwise. In other words, it is a matter of having to uphold one's charge. Judith Butler, however, would like to emphasize the tenuousness of this rare innocence, which has to be repeatedly proved, as it were, and guilt is made into a seductive association of sorts with whom complicity is solicited, and associational aristocracy, in whose midst innocence becomes a charge to be repeatedly vindicated, even as an act of fidelity to the association in question, guilty as it is. Our prior emphasis on the primacy of practice, if you were to pardon my Maoist idiom, seems well guided, as the text does seem to acknowledge the multifacetedness which interpolation may entail. Beyond a moment of recognition, identification, or the assumption of an identity, quote, to master a set of skills is not simply to accept a set of skills, but to reproduce them in and as one's own activity. This is not simply to act according to a set of rules, but to embody rules in a course of action and to reproduce those rules in embodied rituals of action. End of quote. In keeping with the religious metaphorics the author notices in Althusser earlier, we see recourse to the invocation of ritual as a category. The performance of a ritual is said to spawn or perhaps produce a belief, which is then retroactively incorporated into the performance itself. Yet prior to any performance, the acquittal is necessary. Here, we do see a very interesting section, for Judith Butler, the American theorist, seems to directly acknowledge the Slovenian school for the first time. She acknowledges that Mladen Dolar sought to posit a separate domain of the psyche apart from ritual, though here we are not provided with a clear citation. Where I think the argument leads astray or becomes difficult to follow is in the section interpreting Althusser's representation, or rather his failure of presenting the psyche as a separate dimension, a critique levelled by Mladen Dolar. While a citation is provided, it merely leads to the first couple of pages in The Sublime Object of Ideology, a text which may well have the moorings for such an argument, which yet remains uncited in the text under consideration. Yet what we still should note is the recount of the Dollarian notion of the subject of psychoanalysis. From the essay also quoted, Beyond Interpolation, to quote directly, there is a part of the individual that cannot pass into the subject. There is a part of external materiality that cannot be successfully integrated into the interior. End of quote. If interpolation, even when considered as, for instance, in a leap of faith, is completed, the psychoanalytic position here is to add a moment of rest, or rather to study the mode of rest occupied by the subject. Quote, the psychoanalytic operation is to study the rest produced by the operation, its necessary incompleteness. It does not deny the cut, it only adds a rest. The clean cut is always unclean. It cannot produce a flawless interiority of an autonomous subject, and the psychoanalytic subject is coextensive to that very flaw in the interiority. To put it in a short formula, the subject is always the failure to become the subject. End of quote. A forceful formulation indeed, and you will notice one which is conducive to accommodation by many different orientations. In persisting with a comparison via which a critique is posited between the Dollarian and the Althusserian conception of the subject, we see, for instance, an allegation that in Althusser, subjectivity has no place, except perhaps as a critique to subjectivism. The remainder left by subjectivation, which is referred to by Dolar, may be gleaned in some measure by the theorist's own set of interests, such as indeed the voice, which even in the case of a silent voice such as when reading, acts as a lever of thought, as it were, to use one of the author's own phrases. In fact, which of us would fail at recalling the addressal of a voice, such as, for instance, a father or protective caregiver, and our memories or rather associations of love to the voice itself? Such an analogy operates well even with the gaze, and such partial objects, if I may, do form a body of study in psychoanalysis. Perhaps not too far a stretch from the study of slips of tongue in its investigation into the unconscious. And if you were to recall, the author herself seems to carry a genuine and scholastically inflected interest in stubborn and bodily attachments, as the subtitle of her first 2 chapters indicate. Perhaps of more immediate and formal philosophical interest is the critique of the mimetic relation between grammar and ontology, a direction which any supposition regarding a willing or a volitional subject, a trope emphasized earlier, seems to posit. Let me find where I was. In seeking an association with a particular congregation, for example, the installation of the interpellative moment is already prefigured, if not realized. A circularity, if you will, which seems to diminish the idea of the retroactive recognition of oneself in the moment of interpellation as that which is recognized in oneself, or perhaps better yet, our narrative. Let me just repeat this paragraph. Perhaps of more immediate and formal philosophical interest is the critique of the mimetic relation between grammar and ontology, a direction which any supposition regarding a willing or volitional subject, a trope emphasized earlier, seems to posit. In seeking an association with a particular congregation, for example, the installation of the interpellative moment is already prefigured, if not realized. A circularity, if you will, which seems to diminish the idea of the retroactive recognition of oneself in the moment of interpellation as that which is recognized in oneself, or perhaps better yet, our narrative. One way of thinking the subject, which is utilized in literary analysis extensively, is simply as point of view. In the above sentence regarding the subject seeking an association, we do see the condition, as it were, for the subject, and their formation as well, were they to assume such a position. Would this mean that grammar mimes or is the same as ontology? Itself perhaps a reiteration of the now worn idiom of truth being a stylistic effect of language. The primacy of the plot is emphasized, which in any narrative would serve as a requirement for the grammar, or to be more precise, the subject of a sentence, grammatically conceived. Here, the anticipations of grammar would be what arrives necessarily after the fact, once the sentence is written, itself perhaps a function of the narrative in question. Perhaps a textual presentation of the Althusserian maxim of history being a process without a subject, yet a subject which yet emerges, perhaps in narrative, as that which resists it. Here, I should mention that one of my early teachers, Dr. Nilofer Kaul, would like to emphasize what she called a narratorial unconscious, operative in a text. I must state that I find that I would not have much to add to the hazy paragraphs which emphasize an immaterial logic, which may serve as a precondition to ritual, which is itself material. And the question which we are presented is, how is the reenactment of the ritual itself distinguished from that of symbolic automatism? I think a strong corollary may be gleaned in recognizing the ritual as supported, indeed financed, by symbolic automatism, perhaps enshrined in the form of a contract via which a subject may place a demand. Of course, this may not be the only interpretation, but it is perhaps the most common one. Yet the struggle to distinguish such a symbolic automatism from the immaterial logic serving as a precondition to ritual can only be answered to my mind in one of two terms: as an effect of sexuality, or as a resonance to a cultural trope. The ties between these two registers being principally what has constituted the bind of ritual in its relation to a congregation. Let me just repeat that last couple. Yet the struggle to distinguish such a symbolic automatism from the immaterial logic serving as a precondition to ritual can only be answered to my mind in one of two terms. The struggle to distinguish a symbolic automatism from the immaterial logic serving as a precondition to ritual can only be answered in my mind as either an effect of sexuality, the implication of course being that the immaterial logic in question is an effect of sexuality and nothing more or nothing less, or as a resonance to a cultural trope such as material rituals themselves and associations someone may trace between them. Amidst these questions of interpolation per se, and before we enter anything like a poetics of a congregation, an interesting diagonal should be noted in comparing the study of interpolation here with a question that seems to approach the conundrum from the other direction. That is, not as a plaintiff seeking acquittal or acceptance, or as a supplicant before the altar. Quote, how are we to understand desire to be constitutive desire? End of quote. And indeed, is this not the very slippery cube upon which such fetishism of the instant have been recognized? Petulance, peevishness, perversion, mockery, and the stray insult all seem to have their place here, and yet the authors would invoke Spinoza, Nietzsche, and Agamben as figures who have used the tightness of this minimal turn, as it were, to showcase not an interpolation per se, but perhaps what the later Deleuze might have put simply as a becoming, in his singular grammatical modification, placing nouns as adjectives before that verb. And so we may have a becoming monk to describe the work of a writer, for instance, who is exiled and polishes lenses, as the story of Spinoza's life goes. I must admit that the argument in the later sections of the chapter provided very little foothold in seeking to present, for instance, a very fine differentiation between conscience and interpolation by positing a strong attachment as what enables the former at the expense of the latter, even as it allows the latter to work. Echoes of the managerial subject from earlier in the text, perhaps, but in any case, metaphysics for me. Now, I think this is again a section which I would recommend that you read. In its presentation, or rather in its reading, what I would appraise as questions that perhaps may help the next time would, for example, reading some of the theoretical sections regarding concepts become easier to assimilate were they to be read slower, or would their relation to earlier arguments be lost in such an effort? Now, this is something that any reading or any uncritical reading which takes up the appraisal of concepts, which is self-conscious about the kind of language that it is using in its critique of an argument, has to encounter and deal with. And at some level it has to do with how you listen and how your ear is attuned to how you naturally imbibe and assimilate arguments and stories and things of that kind. And some of these presentations are an exercise in being able to lean onto and perhaps grab cadences in thought which you would not encounter in your day-to-day conversations, which can be regimented, which are hegemonized, which are in many ways prosaic. Now, this is not, of course, a defense of the form of a presentation of a paper, which is not to say that such a defense is not required, which is not to say that the form itself is not that of a paper, which ideally should be read. Yet there is perhaps a reason why they are read, and they are read aloud. And there's a reason why they are perhaps not narratives. And this is in many ways an account of how one comes up with an explanation of what one sees in, for example, an article in consideration, such as the chapter in a book, in trying to be able to represent to another as to why, for instance, one may choose to pick up this and not that. We, in many ways, form the coordinates via which another can appraise of our interests. And in many ways, this gaze of the other, or rather our call to such another, via their association which we see in a moment, is what a shallow and unexposed degree of interpolation may be. Yet, this is no blanket and this is no substitute for actually reading the psychic life of power itself. This is a criticism, yet this is a criticism that appraises a work in relation to that which it already takes up. A question of what ideology is, of what interpolation in an ideology may be, about what subjection and what partial subjection may manifest as, about what resistances to these are, and how, for instance, a subject finds ways of creating attachments, perhaps resistances, perhaps fetishisms, as tools to try and navigate such a terrain. Now, as with my earlier readings, I will leave a link to the text itself, and I would advise that you read that. Having said all of this, there is something that I would like to conclude with. And this is a note that I wrote to myself. At this point in the study, I would have to state that I do not see much potential in investigating the formations of melancholy in refused gender identifications, which is what the subtitle of the next chapter is. So I shall lay this book aside for now. And while sexuality is undeniably a latent and exuberant core that constitutes the subject, at least in any psychoanalytic sense, I think a requirement to appraise what impels the subject rather than merely constitutes them may be the order of the hour, which is what will lead me to take up Alenka Zupancic's study of this in her Ethics of the Real. And in many ways this does take me directly back to what Judith Butler does take notice of, perhaps for the first time, in this text, a point which I did raise in the paper in consideration, and that is the Slovenian school, and Alenka Zupancic, of course, being one of the three famous figureheads of that, along with Mladen Dolar and Slavoj Zizek. That would be, of course, the subject of the next video, and what I seek to do briefly is to present an account of, from my brief reading so far, the notion of what the subject as a cut may mean. It's something that we saw Dolar touch on briefly in this paper in the form of quotations, and I think it's something that should be perhaps met with a slightly more sustained reading so that we can clarify our own understandings between, for example, the relations between the Slovenian school and maybe a slightly earlier tradition of psychoanalysis already embedded and formalized in American academia. Now, that is all for today. This has been a slightly rushed video, but I tried to tie it together as well as possible. Read the text if you would like to follow it. That will help more than most other approaches. And with that, I shall bid you a good evening and catch you the next time. Bye bye.